This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Loud and Clear: The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection. The author is Brian Anderson. Loud and Clear is the first book to tell the full story of the Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound, an unprecedented and since unparalleled speaker system that was as tall as a school bus is long and more than 100 feet wide. The band's quest for roaring yet crystal clear sound began after their formation in 1965, colliding with the 60s progressive social climate. Brian Anderson has been a Webby Award-winning senior features editor, writer, and producer at Vice. More recently, he did a stint as a science editor at The Atlantic, where he was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team for early pandemic coverage, and was later an editor at Vox. He lives in Chicago with his partner. Loud and Clear is his very first book. And happy to have, we love having first time authors on Speaking of Writers. Happy to have Brian Anderson join me now here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve. This is a real delight to chat with you.
Thank you. Same here. So, what inspired you to write an entire book focused on the Wall of Sound?
Well, the Grateful Dead sound system has captivated me my entire life. So, when I was just a toddler, my parents would bring my sister and I up to Grateful Dead shows in Wisconsin. At the time, this was the late 80s. My dad was working for the Grateful Dead's Midwest local crew, so he was like a stagehand. So he would, roll out the ornate kind of Afghan style stage rugs that the band performed on, and he would help, the road crew kind of rig up their PA in the late 80s, which was a much different sound system than the one that I wrote about in the book. Um, but you know, a lot of what they were using at the time in the late 80s was sort of owing to like the ground that they broke with the wall of sound. Um, so really my earliest flashes of memory are of seeing this band perform, right? And just sort of being taken aback by like, the Dead's soundscape. So, over the years growing up, my sister and I would overhear my parents, on long road trips, right? They would talk about seeing the band back in this era in the early to mid 70s when the Dead were performing through this mountain of speakers, and they called it the Wall of Sound. And, it would blow the minds of the audience, right? So that was including my parents who were going to see shows back then. Um, so that just always like kind of has had its hooks in me, like the idea of this massive mountain of speakers. And so, fast forward to 2013, 2014, when I was an editor at Vice, at the technology vertical at Vice. And I got it in my head that I wanted to write about the Wall of Sound, which is a groundbreaking piece of technology. So I was like, I want to do the deep dive on the Wall of Sound. And that took the form of a 9,000 or so word web story that came out in 2015. And that got a decent amount of attention, which always feels good when you're a journalist. Like you want folks to read and consume your stories. And I was at the time thinking like, wow, I really went deep on this topic. Surely this is the definitive take on the Wall of Sound. But very quickly, in the days after that story came out, I realized that there was so much more to this story, and I just kind of barely got to scratching the surface of something much deeper. So that's kind of when I had the initial flash of an idea like, I think maybe there's a book here. Maybe I could do a book on this one day. So I kind of filed that idea away, but in the ensuing 10 years till now, I just kind of, kept gathering little bits of string here and there. Um, and now here we are. And the book has been out for a month. It's crazy. And so I sort of feel like I've been working on this book my entire life in a way that might sound like a little cheesy or like a little kind of cliche, but you know, this thing has captivated me since a very, very young age. And I just feel like I've been kind of, yeah, doing the survey of dead materials out there my entire life and just collecting string and doing the reporting. And suddenly we have a book and it's out in the world.
You open the book with the artifact, which, by the way, is right over Brian's shoulder there. We're going to get to that story in a moment. The Wall of Sound
Yeah.
is often mythologized, Brian, by deadheads. You said you wanted to do a deeper dive into it. Did you want to clarify or celebrate or demystify anything about it in your book?
Yes. It occurred to me very early on when the book project was in its infancy, really. It occurred to me that the Wall of Sound was really the culmination of this years long progression that started basically at the beginning of the band in the mid 1960s. So, contrary to, you know, a lot of people sort of when they think about the Dead's Wall of Sound, they think of 1974, that year, and there was a run of 40 shows that the Dead played that year through this system. And I wanted to dispel the notion that this thing just dropped out of the clear blue sky, fully formed in 1974. Because the reality was that the Dead and their circle of audio wizards and sound consultants and roadies and just all of the interesting people that they were pulling into their orbit were chipping away at this thing for the better part of a decade, like show in and show out through trial and error, fits and starts. So that's one thing that I really tried to illuminate in the book is that this thing didn't just appear one day, fully formed. It was the culmination of like this years long project. And in order to tell that story, I had to start at the very beginning with like the very first iteration of a Dead sound system, right? Like what were the very first speakers that they performed through? So after the intro chapter, we get to chapter two, and that's where the story begins in late 64, early 65, when this circle of friends, really, who were playing music together, start kind of congealing and they're playing under the Warlocks moniker with a very first sound system that was purchased by Jerry Garcia's mother, Ruth. So that's really where the story begins. That's the first sound system that like all of this kind of branches out from. So it's a huge story. So I knew that it couldn't just be the story of 1974 in Grateful Dead history. It had to start at the beginning and sort of encompass this first kind of grand 10-year era of the band.
You mentioned audio engineers earlier, techies. There's a guy by the name of Owsley Bear Stanley.
Hmm.
And Stanley was pivotal to the Wall of Sound's creation. How would you describe his influence on both the band and the technology?
Yes. Well, from a very practical standpoint, Owsley Stanley, aka Bear, was very deep pocketed. Um, he was making a lot of money from his clandestine LSD manufacturing operation. So when he first saw the Dead, rather the Warlocks at that point, in late 1965, he was so taken by their sound that he was basically like, I need to follow this band to the ends of the earth and see how I can contribute. So initially, that took the form of him basically bankrolling the band. He was their initial patron. He could buy them top flight gear that really set them above most any other band going at the time. So there was that aspect of his influence. He just had a lot of money that he could funnel into the Dead sound. Um, but more than that, Owsley, he had these original kind of visions for what became the Wall of Sound. And those sort of came to him in early 1966 when the Dead were spending a couple months in Los Angeles. Owsley was paying their rent. He was paying for all their groceries. They had to adhere to his very strict all meat and all milk diet. He was a very interesting man. Uh, but he would sit around watching the Dead rehearse at their shared home in Los Angeles or perform around town through the next iteration of their sound system, which was Owsley's home hi-fi stereo. He was basically like, "Why don't you guys use my system as your rig?" So he would sit around watching the band perform high on his own supply of LSD, and he had synesthesia, so he could experience one sense through another. So the way that he experienced sound, he sort of saw sound as color. So he would sit around watching the band rehearse or perform around town, and their sound waves would be flowing out of his rig in as what he called interacting and emanating waves of color. So that had a really profound impact on him. And he thought to himself, this is not what I thought this sound was going to feel like. And I need to remember what this sensation is like. So fast forward basically 10 years to the full wall of sound. And that sound system was really a vehicle for Bear to kind of like conjure that feeling, conjure those visions that he had in early 1966. So he, was very much the force of ideas behind this audio project. And some of his ideas were way out there. And sometimes, he would kind of clash with others in the band's sound and road crews. Um, but they needed that force of ideas. But he also needed others who had more hands-on technical expertise to actually kind of help actualize some of his ideas. But a lot of people take credit for the Wall of Sound, which was an interesting, like, you know, just sort of through the reporting that sort of came out, various folks will be like, well, I invented the Wall of Sound, or like, that's what led me to create the Wall of Sound, right? When in reality, like it took this whole circle of people to actualize this thing. But if there's one person who I can kind of point to as being completely integral, without whom the Wall of Sound wouldn't exist, it would be Owsley Stanley. Yeah.
Let's talk about the artifact over your shoulder there. What's the story
Yeah.
behind it? How did you get it?
So the artifact, or what I call the artifact, is a busted up speaker cabinet that I acquired through a Sotheby's auction in late 2021. Sotheby's partnered with Grateful Dead Productions to auction off around 150 lots from the Grateful Dead's Northern California warehouse. So it was a lot of, decommissioned gear and just all sorts of ephemera. So I knew that this auction was going on, but I didn't bother to start scrolling through the lots. So it wasn't an in-person auction. This was like, all kind of digital bids. I didn't bother looking through the lots until I think there was 24 hours left before bidding closed. And I finally started looking through. And of course, immediately I was like, wow, yeah, this stuff is really, really cool. Old amplifiers from the Wall of Sound, all sorts of really neat stuff. And, I have a very limited budget. I didn't have $250,000 to throw down on Jerry Garcia's Budman Macintosh amplifier from the Wall of Sound. So I was like, just out of curiosity, I wonder what has the lowest starting bid. And it's this piece that I now own. And the starting bid was $800. And compared with some of the other items, the description for this piece was very bare bones. All it said was, you know, monitor speaker used on stage. One 12-inch cone is missing and two 5-inch cones missing. That's all it said. Super bare bones. Whereas other lots in this auction were very explicitly detailed, like, this was in the Wall of Sound, gave like really kind of all the technical specs. But this was super bare bones, and yet I had looked at enough photos of the Wall of Sound to that point to have the hunch, just looking at this, like the professional Sotheby's photos, that, I was pretty sure this was from the 73, 74 era, kind of right in the Wall of Sound, just looking at the vintage and the condition of this cabinet. So I turned to my partner, Lex, and I was like, should I put a bid in on this? And she said, if you feel strongly about it, you should do it. And then my next move was to call my parents because I really learned everything I know about the Grateful Dead just from them, from absorbing knowledge from them over the years. So I called them and I said, hey, should I bid on this busted up speaker that's up for auction? And they said, if you feel strongly about it, you should do it. So I did. I had the leading bid for 23 hours. And then in that last hour, it was me and somebody out there going just back and forth, tit for tat. And uh, you know, the price tag was rapidly escalating. But I was committed. I was locked in, and I was like, I can't back out now. I need to get this piece. So I did, and I had it shipped to my parents' place, my childhood home out in the Chicago suburbs, because that was cheaper than having it shipped to my apartment in the city here. And it showed up, and we opened it in their garage. And the first thing I did was to literally stick my head inside of it. So, like I mentioned, one of the two 12-inch speaker cones is missing. It must have been cannibalized. The Dead must have, after the Wall of Sound realized like, hey, we need a 12-inch cone to fit in this other speaker cabinet. Like just pull that one out of this cabinet and plug it in over there. So there's this gaping hole in the artifact. So using the light of my phone, I stuck my head inside of it, and on the back of the other remaining 12-inch JBL cone, I picked up a couple clues that, aha, I think my hunch was correct that this was, in fact, part of the Wall of Sound of 1974. So that really kicked the book project into high gear. And having a piece from this historic sound system really gave me a window to tell this much bigger story about obsession and titanic human achievement and the Dead's quest for audio perfection. I had a very unique way into this story by owning a piece. So that's when I kind of had the flash like, aha, I can bookend this story kind of in present day with the artifact. And then really the meat of the book, like I said, sort of spans like that first 10-year grand era of the band from 65 to the end of 1974. But it's a very cool item to have, and it allowed me to get in touch and speak with pretty much everyone who was in the room back in this signal moment at the table working with the band to build this thing from scratch. And I could reach out to these people and say, hey, I have a piece of the Wall of Sound. Like, what can you tell me about this? So they could, shed light on the artifact. And so the artifact is kind of a through line. If you read the book, it pops up quite a bit. Um, and it's definitely haunted, but in a good way. My mind kind of reels thinking about like all of the miles that this thing clocked and the hundreds of thousands of people who received the signals kind of coming out of it. And I sort of learned through reporting the book that this cabinet is, or was rather, a vocal fill monitor. So not PHIL like Phil Lesh, but FILL, a vocal fill monitor on Garcia's side. So Jerry Garcia's vocals were flowing out of this artifact here. So it's a very special thing to have, and there's not too much of the Wall of Sound remaining today. So to have a piece of this thing and to uh, uh, basically be able to use it as this window into this bigger story, that's when I knew like, aha, I can do the book now because I have a piece of it.
Brian, what made the wall of sound such a revolutionary concept in live audio engineering at the time?
Yeah. Well, at the time, there was no such thing. And by at the time, I mean, right, starting in the mid 60s when the band got going, and then, through the end of 1974, at which point the Dead took a hiatus, there was really no such thing as a musical PA. So the famous example of the Beatles at Shea Stadium, right? They performed through, a public address system that was just meant for, like vocals, right? Or like literal like announcements, like the announcer at the ball game, like, given the score or whatever. Um, that's what they performed through. The sound was horrendous. And at a much smaller scale, if you go to any club or bar at the time, um, if they had anything by way of like an in-house sound system, it was usually just one small little box to each side of the stage. So the sound was horrendous when this band got going in the mid 1960s. And at the time, they were confronted with pre-war technology. That was kind of the state of the art as far as like, sound reinforcement. Um, so the Dead immediately were on this quest to achieve something better and purer, and a sound that wasn't just loud, but was clear. So I think the Wall of Sound really represents that idea of, not just blasting an audience with like harsh noise, but delivering sound with a clarity such that someone who's in the furthest reaches of a hall or the furthest reaches of like an outdoor stadium was getting an experience that was like just as high quality as someone who was right up front. Um, so I think that whole approach to sound reinforcement really kind of set the blueprint for how we experience live music to this day. And there's all sorts of, echoes and reverberations and lasting impacts of the wall of sound that you can see today from a giant stadium down to a small little club. So take a curved speaker, for example. The Dead were the first to sort of like rig up or fly a curved speaker. And you curve a speaker in order to like throw or sweep the sound across an
Hmm.
audience. So no one had done that to that point. Um, but you see a curved speaker array, or even like the whole idea of a linear array stacking up speakers. No one was doing that until the Dead came around with the wall of sound. And that's commonplace today in any sort of like sound reinforcement setting. Um, so that's just, a couple examples of how they really set the blueprint. Even delay towers. If you go to a big show today, a big stadium show, you're going to see concentric rings of speakers out in the audience to account for the distance that the sound has to travel. The Dead were really the ones who, over a series of shows in the summer of 1973, figured out how to use delay and how to implement delay towers. So you see the lasting impacts of the wall of sound and all the like adjacent audio work that the Dead were doing around the wall. You see it everywhere today. Um, and also, I think the whole idea behind the wall of sound was really to eliminate the barriers between the musicians and the audience so that everyone was in the same sound field, sort of traveling together. So that's why with the wall of sound, everything, all the gear was set up in a unified backline behind the band. So the wall of sound was effectively the band's monitor system. And that right there, that allowed, the band and the musicians, or excuse me, the band and the crowd to really all hear the same exact thing. So, in the words of the late great Steve Silberman, who I talked to for the book, he called that cosmic democracy. So that's sort of like the headier level to the Wall of Sound project was to sort of achieve that cosmic democracy. Because with the Dead, it was always this symbiotic relationship between the crowd and the band, sort of feeding off one another.
The book is The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection. The author is Brian Anderson. Loud and clear. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.
Thanks. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thank you for watching. I'm Steve Richards.